Well, people are trickling in, and I'm so happy for the people that decided to join today. This is a very emotional topic, very close to my heart, probably the closest to my heart. As many of you know, I've worked with gorillas for many years and learned that they absolutely are persons and have culture. And then I went on to do sanctuary work for farmed animals. And it was very clear from my experiences over the years that they were the same. And under any defensible um, criteria for personhood, they meet that. And so I think it's crucial for us to understand that as long as society has a category of animal, it's always going to be the case that they whip that out of their back pocket when it's convenient or necessary in their estimation, so that they can push human beings down into that category. And that's why I think that until we take animal personhood seriously, we're not going to really get anywhere in terms of human rights, because really it's all the same power structure. Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King, and definitely his equal, as well as Martin Luther King's son, agreed about this, that this is a natural extension of nonviolent work toward the inclusion of all persons to thrive and have safety, well-being, and respect in the world. And I love that, because this issue does involve a great deal of damage to immigrants, for example, who work in these slaughterhouses and so forth, racism, the environment, certainly. Uh, all of these things are very much intersectional with animal well-being. So I'm, again, very passionate about that. So happy to turn it over to Ombre.
Thank you so much, Don. Thank you, Don and Roger, for having me. So I'm Ombre Tarania, I use they, she pronouns. For those who may find it useful, I am a white person with short brown hair, I have green eyes, wearing silver loop earrings, glasses, and a septum piercing, and a gray top. Um, I also wanted to thank I think is with us for introducing me to Casey and Don. I live in Europe, as you probably have heard, so I don't always get the chance to attend the sessions live, but I've been enjoying watching some of them online, the recordings. I've already learned a lot from the community, and I'm excited for the opportunity to learn together again today. In terms of social positioning, I'm also an autistic and non-binary person. I am a PhD student in philosophy based in Paris and currently finishing my thesis, which is called Autism and Animality, towards a more than human and more than neurological turn in neurodiversity studies. And so today I'll present some of the main ideas that I've developed in this project. So let me try and share my screen. Here you go. I hope you see correctly. Um, I'm going to be using this sort of trilingual slideshow, which hopefully is not full of mistakes. And I'm going to speak for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and then we can hopefully move on to a collective discussion, maybe Q&A. So I chose to title this session Autism and Animality, but what does that mean? Often when I tell people that my PhD thesis focuses on autism and animality, they sort of struggle to understand what that could mean. Do we not already have enough to deal with as autistic humans? Do we really need to bring animals into this? What does animality have to do with autism to begin with? They ask. And these are good questions, so let me try and answer briefly. Through my doctoral research, I have identified three core dimensions of this subject. First, the relationship between autistic people and non-human animals, and more broadly between the neurodiversity movement and animalist movements. Secondly, the question of knowing whether autistic people are more, less, or equally animal compared to holistics, and whether we should reject or reclaim this comparison. Thirdly, the possibility of animal neurodivergence, namely the idea that neurodivergence and maybe autism also exists in non-human animals. Before going further, I wanted to mention the excellent discussions on autism and animality at Casey last year with David Varela Trejo and Berenice Vargas Garcia. I got the chance to watch them and I agree with everything that was said. So I would encourage you to go and watch them on YouTube if you're interested in hearing more. I'll try not to repeat too much for those of you who have attended or who, like me, watched it afterwards. With this talk, I'm trying to map some of the sites where autism and animality meet. I'll do so in three parts, echoing the three dimensions that I've just mentioned. First, I'll explore the idea that autistic humans often have a strong affinity with non-human animals, but instead of assuming that this bond is purely natural or biologically determined, I'll take an ethical and political approach. This means that we should not overgeneralize, and we'll also look at cases where autistic people's interest in animals has caused harm rather than benefits. Next, I'll discuss what Berenice Vargas Garcia calls animality or autistic animality, and I'll try to show that because autistic people are often dehumanized, comparing autistics to non-human animals can sometimes be harmful. While the concept of the human was historically framed around neurotypicality, most of the neurodiversity movement has tried to assert that autistic people are fully human and therefore deserve human rights. Yet, dehumanization is always rooted in speciesism and anti-animal biases, as are the concepts of humanity and human rights to some extent. So, if we want to avoid further harming animals, it may be worth reclaiming our animality instead. Finally, I'll conclude with a discussion of autism and neurodivergence in animals, arguing that neurodivergence is not a uniquely human phenomenon, but fundamentally an animal one. To do so, I'll introduce a new more than human framework for neurodiversity with the concepts of ethodiversity and ethodivergence. There's going to be sort of philosophical concepts throughout, but you don't have to remember all of them. They don't really matter. They're just a way to sort of get my ideas throughout, but the ideas themselves matter most. So I'm going to start with this idea of the relationship between autistic people and non-human animals. So as you probably know, many autistic people report having a strong affinity, a strong bond with animals. This claim has been supported not only by scientific research, but also by autobiographical writings by autistic people ourselves, such as Don's fantastic book, Songs of the Gorilla Nation, which I read very early in my journey, my doctoral journey, and which has inspired me throughout. So I think that more interesting than examining whether autistics are often more bonded with animals than allistics is the question why. Why is it? Why is that? Temple Grandin, an autistic engineer, has famously argued that autistic brains are similar to those of farmed animals, particularly due to deficits in the frontal lobes. She uses this to suggest that autistic people experience the world in ways similar to animals. But while this argument creates a sense of natural affinity, Grandin's claims have been critiqued by neuroscientists, neurodiversity scholars, and autistic activists alike. For example, proponents of the intense world theory of autism show that autistic neurology is not marked by deficits, but rather by hyperprocessing. This means that autistic people are not disconnected from the world, rather we are often more sensitive to it. Critical animal studies and critical disability studies scholars have also challenged Grandin's argument as essentialist. Basically, this means that it overgeneralizes autism. As we know, if you've met one autistic person, well, you've met one autistic person and not autism itself. Critics also argue that Grandin exoticizes autism by framing it as a superpower for understanding animals, which ultimately contributes to dehumanization. Furthermore, framing autistic neurology as the explanation for affinity with animals can serve to justify their exploitation. Grandin, as an engineer for the animal industrial complex, has developed so-called humane ways to slaughter animals, relying on superpowers of her autistic brain. Similarly, I've come across arguments about using autistic traits to justify eating animal products or using them in therapies. And these are pretty complex topics which deserve more nuance than this, but they do show a troubling trend. Autistic traits are often invoked to justify the oppression of animals, maybe more rarely so to support their liberation. And maybe when they do, we haven't had or found the sort of community platform to sort of gather these and concepts to gather these claims and make a strong case for it. So there are many ways that autistic traits can indeed reinforce speciesism. So speciesism is the oppression of animals by virtue of the fact that they're not human. So it's a species-based form of oppression. And sometimes autistic fascination with animals can unintentionally harm them. Animals may become objects of collection, study, which is fine, but also exploitation. And sometimes these practices may end up denying their autonomy and their subjectivity. I'm not suggesting that this is particularly common or that it would be unique to autistics, of course, but that does happen. And I think it's especially problematic when neurodivergent traits are weaponized against animal liberation. For example, in Neurodivergent by Nature, which is a recent book, author Joe Harkness justifies entomology, which is a practice of collecting insects based on his neurodivergent traits. And well, from what I've gathered, and maybe I'm wrong, but it looks like entomology entails violent practices such as trapping and killing bugs. And Harkness acknowledges that his hobby may sound cruel or even weird, he says, but he tries to reassure the readers that it is in fact humane. So humane practice again. But by using weirdness as an argument, he implicitly weaponizes his neurodivergence, sorry, against vegan or anti-speciesist principles. I propose the term neurodivergent speciesism to describe such situations where neurodivergent traits or autistic culture are used to justify harm towards animals. In Harkness's case, his special interest and his neurodivergent fascination with nature, as he calls it, are used to justify trapping and killing. Similarly, Grandin has used her public platform to morally justify animal slaughter. My problem with these stories is not that they refer to weird or quirky practices, namely neurodivergent practices in a way, but that they use neurodivergence and therefore weirdness or a sort of reclaimed version of weirdness as an excuse for violence. On the other hand, autistic voices have also advocated for animal liberation. So Don, who is here, for example, has developed what I see as a unique and autism-informed approach to animal advocacy. Academics like Berenice Vargas Garcia or myself, but also many more, have explored neurodivergent approaches to veganism and anti-speciesism. I propose the terms neurodivergent veganism and neurodivergent anti-speciesism to describe these uniquely autistic or otherwise neurodivergent perspectives on animal politics. Instead of using autism to justify oppression, these approaches use it to promote liberation. In short, autistic culture, as we've seen, shows ambivalence in its relationship with animals. While many of us do love animals, this love is never innocent. Indeed, feminist activism has taught us that harm can be done in the name of love. Therefore, autistic people are not inherently purer or more innocent than allistics, but we do have unique perspectives that can either support or hinder animal liberation, maybe sometimes both at once. So let's try and be also responsible ethically for our uh, positions. So I'm now going to turn to the dehumanization of autistic people and what I call the bestialization of animals. Again, a bit of a difficult couple of words, but I'm going to explain them. As we've seen with Grandin and Harkness, there is a common rhetoric that associates autistic people with animals. And while this discourse is often tied to dehumanization, academic scholarship identifies two main forms of dehumanization. First, animalization, which is where a person's humanity is denied through comparisons to animals. And secondly, mechanization, which is where it is denied through comparisons to machines. It does seem to me that this distinction can be a bit arbitrary, especially given that animals themselves have often been compared to machines in Western philosophy, for example, by Descartes. And while both forms of dehumanization, as you probably are aware, have been witnessed regarding autism, historically, autistic people have been likened to what we called feral children, which were children raised by wolves or other animals and who behaved like these animals. Some historians seem to believe that the figure of the feral child was the ancestor of the figure of the autistic in Western societies. Autistic humans are also often compared to robots and machines or even aliens. And the term autistic has been used to describe behavioral traits like withdrawal and also asociality. This rhetoric, I think, does not really target actual autistic people, but rather reflects society's autistic-phobic bias. So you're not saying, when you say this is autistic or I'm not autistic, I mean, we don't say this, but they do sometimes. They don't mean actual autistic people because they don't know what we're like, but it's representations, and they say, oh, well, maybe, the earth has become autistic or our societies because we're not connected to nature anymore, whatever bias they have. In these representations, often being autistic implies being closer to an animal than a human, as if autism were an intermediate state between human and animal. This is exactly what critics of Temple Grandin point out in her work. Her claim that autistic people are naturally closer to animals than humans can be dehumanizing. Animals have often been described as lacking qualities supposedly unique to humans like language, culture, imagination, or empathy. We now know that these ideas are wrong and that animals are much closer to us than we previously believed. Still, when autistic people are compared to animals in this way, it can often harm both autistic people and animals. Inspired by philosopher Judith Butler, I make a distinction between positive or value-neutral forms of comparisons and negative ones. I use the term, or at least that's what I'm going to do here. I use the term animalization to describe cases where animals are not devalued, and bestialization to describe cases where they are. The term bestialization evokes the figure of the beast, which when you say beast, you don't say animal, it's more negative. And indeed, in French, it evokes the figure of the bête. In French, which is my native language, bête is polysemous. As a noun, it refers to the animal, and it's, as I said, usually negative. So it's also the brute, and you can also say that of a human person. And as an adjective, it means stupid. So to be bête is to be stupid, it's to be animal, it's to be perhaps all at once in their eyes. And so, as I said, both meanings are derogatory. This double meaning reveals the entanglement of neuronormativity, which is the oppression of neurodivergent people, and speciesism, the oppression of animals in modern Western thought. Berenice Vargas Garcia also evidences the entanglement of speciesism and ableism, the oppression of animals and disabled people, respectively, among which autistics. But why is it that where autistic people are oppressed, animals are often also involved? And why do the social, political, and scientific apparatuses that oppress non-human animals also historically target autistic people? I argue that a unique form of oppression emerges at the intersection of neurodiversity and animality, and that's actually what I call bestialization. For example, scientific research using lab mice and rats to model autism illustrates the entanglement of neuronormative dehumanization and anti-animal speciesism. Scientists use genetic mutations or chemicals to induce autistic traits in rodents, hoping it will help them better understand autism in humans. But while the rodents are used to define autism in humans, they themselves are denied the very label autistic. That means the scientists will not call them that. They refuse to call them autistic. They are what I call constitutive others of scientific autism, which means that they are used to establish the category, the concept of autism scientifically, while being excluded from it. These scientific practices are also violent, ethically problematic, and most of the time they have little scientific validity anyways. They rely on assumptions about the nature of autism and the nature of animality that are fraught with speciesist and neuronormative representations. Autistic communities have been vocal in opposing such practices of autism science, which ultimately most often try to find a cure for autism. I haven't seen as much of a discourse trying to oppose the use of animals in experimentation, specifically when it comes to animal models of autism, but I mean that's just an extension in a way. These examples also illustrate this concept that I proposed, bestialization, because they disregard the desires, the voices, and well-being of both autistics and animals, thus dehumanizing the former and negatively animalizing the latter. As you see, dehumanization is almost always tied to bestialization. When someone is dehumanized, it often involves negative comparisons to animals. This shows that dehumanization is not only about neuronormativity or autistophobia, it's also informed by anti-animal sentiments. And this matters because marginalized human groups and social justice movements often resist dehumanization by insisting on their humanity. Indeed, the neurodiversity movement has largely followed what I call a humanist strategy, which is to assert that autistic people are fully human and therefore deserve human rights, which in a sense is true. I'm not, questioning that, of course. But this strategy, or also, moreover, this strategy is important. It's sometimes very effective, but I fear it can also unintentionally harm other animals by throwing them under the bus. Humanism, for those who might not be familiar with the concepts, is a philosophical, scientific, and political movement that developed in early modern Europe. It's often seen as a positive thing because it's contributed to social change and new rights for marginalized people. And so social movements like feminism and other movements have heavily relied on it, while also more and more increasingly being critical of it. And therefore, post-humanist thinkers have shown that humanism was in fact built on exclusion. Women, BIPOC, children, disabled people, animals, and many more marginalized groups were systematically left out of the so-called universal human rights, which were sometimes also called the rights of man, and that's not a coincidence. Similarly, the concept of the typical human relies on excluding many forms of difference, such as blackness, indigeneity, femininity, queerness, transness, animality, neurodivergence, madness, childhood, and others. In humanist terms, a normal human is expected to look others in the eyes, to sit still, use their words to communicate, be social with other humans, etc. So when we realize that neurodivergent people are yet to become properly human in our societies, it also appears that the category human was never actually made for us. Efforts to include autistic people in this category often depend on excluding further marginalized populations. We're humans, not animals, some say or assert. Neurodivergents don't have disorders, but mad people do, others add. For those of us with privileges, such as being white or citizens from global minority countries, this is much easier to say. Others may not have the same opportunity. Moreover, the primary exclusion is that of the animal. The human only exists in opposition to the animal, and other animals will never get the chance to be recognized as human. That humanism is rooted in both speciesism and neuronormativity, among other forms of, oppressions, suggests that advocating for ourselves and other animals as autistic people may require moving beyond humanism. And posthumanism offers such a perspective, at least in my opinion. Through a posthumanist approach, I suggest we reclaim not our humanity, but our humanimality, namely our human animal nature. So we're always necessarily both. Reclaiming our animality as autistic people can also help us understand that neurodivergence was never a human phenomenon to begin with. And that brings me to the last part of my talk. Here, I want to argue that neurodivergence is fundamentally an animal phenomenon and not a human phenomenon. Oh, I went too fast. Most definitions of neurodiversity that I've encountered focus on humans and exclude animals. We could say that they're anthropocentric, and that's even within neurodiversity studies, within the neurodiversity movement. That said, in the neurodiversity movement, I've also heard a lot of people who, like me, believe that neurodiversity also includes the other animals. Neurodiversity is usually understood as the infinite variability in human nervous systems and neurocognitive functioning. Here I'm inspired by Nick Walker's definition, which I'm more or less paraphrasing. But if nervous systems are the biological basis for autism and other neurodivergences, then why exclude other animals? After all, most animal species are endowed with nervous systems, so neurodiversity should logically include them. But does that mean that neurodivergence itself actually exists in other animals? Does autism? If you've spent sufficient time within neurodivergent communities online or elsewhere, and probably in this one, because although I haven't heard it yet, you're probably familiar with the phrase cats are autistic, dogs have ADHD. And these are playful metaphors. They are helpful to describe our human experiences of autism and ADHD and our bonds with cats and dogs. But sometimes they tend to oversimplify and erase the diversity that exists within these species. Provided that autism and ADHD exist in other species, it's pretty clear that not every cat is autistic and not every dog has ADHD. Animal psychiatrists and veterinarians have begun to actually consider that neurodivergent traits exists in other animals. They're often hesitant to call them autism or ADHD directly, perhaps because they're afraid about anthropomorphizing, which is making them look too similar to us or projecting human experiences onto them and therefore not really acknowledging their own differences. Instead, they use terms like autism-like or ADHD-like, which means that in their eyes, it's like autism, it's like ADHD, but it's not really the same thing. In other cases, they make up completely new words like the diagnosis HSHA, short for hypersensitive hyperactive, which reflects traits that are similar to both autism and ADHD, from what I've gathered. But given the widely pathologizing and dehumanizing perspectives on autism developed by psychiatrists and scientists, why should we give them priority in defining animal neurodivergence? Indeed, if neurotypicality refers to traits associated with a typical human, then at least one thing is clear, and that's that non-human animals can never be neurotypical because they never comply with our expectations for humans. Does that make them neurodivergent? That is a bit harder to say. Neurodivergence is often described in relation to neurology as the concept of neurotype shows, but animal brains and animal cognition are harder for us to understand. That is for two main reasons. First, well, we don't experience them directly, even if that's also true of other humans, but that's even more foreign for us. And that's because they're also different from ours, even biologically. What would an autistic animal look like? Instead of focusing on neurology and diagnostic categories, I think it may be useful to expand our gaze. Animal enthusiasts are well aware that some animals are a bit different from their peers. And it's also increasingly clear that relationships to humans, domestication, captivity, and climate change can produce behavioral traits that are atypical for given animal species. So they may be disorientated, they may be, I'm going to say this, why am I jumping? Anyways, for example, the cat who is so understimulated that they become depressed, or the zoo lion who paces in their cage as a way to deal with captivity. These animals are definitely not neurotypical. Many animals also exhibit autistic-like traits such as stimming or sensory overload, but also signs of anxiety, depression, trauma, madness, and more. Sure, their neurological structures may differ from ours, and they may not qualify for formal diagnosis, but does that really matter? Instead of drawing on neurology, I am inspired by ethology, the scientific study of behavior in human and non-human animals. I'm using contemporary critical approaches in ethology to develop the concepts of ethodiversity and ethodivergence. So that's going to be a sort of series of concepts, and bear with me. Ethodiversity refers to the variety of ways of being and behaving in the animal world. Instead of neurotypes, we could speak of ethologies, namely behavioral, existential styles. By extension, ethodivergence describes ways of being and behaving that are atypical for a species or ecological context, but also to moments when animals behave in ways that resist human, or should I say humanist, expectations. For example, we expect cats to be affectionate, so we euthanize those who resist petting and attack humans. We expect horses to obey us, so we euthanize those who resist being ridden. We expect cows to produce milk and calves, so we euthanize those who don't meet productivity standards. Finally, we expect birds, but the list could go on. We expect birds to be able to fly, so we let disabled ones die as if their lives were no longer worth living. These expectations and social norms constitute ethonormativity, the imposition of species-specific and species-typical behaviors to serve human interests. The theoretical framework of ethodiversity and ethodivergence that I've developed serves two purposes. Firstly, it centers animality in neurodiversity. Ethology as an animal science reminds us that humans are part of the animal world. Secondly, it highlights the limits of a purely neurological perspective. So what do I mean by that? Well, to take an example, as I understand it, the concept of neuroholography, which has been often discussed in this community, doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the brain itself, in my perspective, because it extends beyond the broader, extends to the broader web of perception, affects, ontology, and holistic connection to the world. A strictly neurological focus is too narrow, too reductive to capture our shared animality, but it's also too obsessed with the brain to truly resist neurotypicality. Hence the concept of ethodivergence, which to me englobes or encompasses, includes neurodivergence, but is way more holistic and broad. So while non-human animals may not always be neurodivergent in the human or neurological sense or clinical sense, many of them, alongside autistic humans, are ethodivergent. They resist normative expectations about perception, behavior, and embodiment. By recognizing this, we can reconnect to the animality within ourselves and in others, opening pathways to new forms of kinship and solidarity between autistic humans and non-human animals. Therefore, while my approach is pretty philosophical, as you've seen, and I hope it hasn't been too unclear or too heavy for everyone, it is also practical. It aims to foster effective and political connections and coalitions between animalist movements and the neurodiversity movement. By reclaiming neurodivergence as an animal phenomenon, I hope we can better resist the entangled depressions that Western humanist norms have created and imagine fairer and more sustainable ways of existing together and with other than human beings. Thank you for your attention. I'm excited for the chat, the conversation, and if you're interested in hearing more, you can have a look at my blog, ombraragna.com, or a paper that I've written that has inspired some of this talk with the journal trace or the Spanish translation that was published this year. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Brava. Perfect. How beautiful that was. I
Thank
can't thank
you.
you enough. So before I turn it over for Q&A, it reminds me of a conference I went to where there was a neurologist trying to figure out how to cure autism, and he was saying from his pulpit that he would search out the most social and empathetic of the monkeys in his colony and kill them to fractionate their brains to find out where empathy lies. And I thought, if that is not a snapshot of the entire problem in one minute speech, I don't know what is. That just made such an impact on me. But I'm anxious to turn it over to everyone. If you can, raise your hand, wave in the window, or you can use the icon hand raising button. We often have moments of silence, which are fine to let people gather their thoughts. Some people process during that time. As always, we always keep things respectful, and that's almost never a problem in this group, which I appreciate. So yeah, let's go.
Thank you so much for coming. It was great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to pop in and say thank you very, very much. I've got to go because I've got work, but that was amazing. Thank you, Casey team and everybody. Bye.
Someone was asking, is there a paper or article that we can read or skim on this topic? That was from.
Oh yeah, well there is this paper that I mentioned at the end called Biodiversity, Neurodiversity, Ethodiversity towards a more than human and more than neurological turn in neurodiversity studies. I think it was linked in the chat and well you can have a look. It's sort of a synthetic version of this. I'm also reading a question by how do you feel about the idea of companion support animals for the disabled from this ethical lens? I feel like that's one of the complex topics that I've mentioned. Um, I feel like I have to say I'm not a specialist of this very topic, so I don't want to like make conclusions too quickly. From what I've read or heard, I feel like there's different perspectives in animal studies and critical animal studies about the ways of doing this. And maybe it would not so much be a way of a question of whether we should do it, but a question of how and which ways of doing it are more ethical and which ways are harmful to the animals themselves. Um, but even when I've heard of it being done in more ethical ways, I've been to, for instance, critical animal studies conferences where they would address this example of uh, support animals for autistics, and they would use animal-friendly language, but then neuronormative and autistic-phobic language. So I'm a bit like, well, it has to be both, and I feel like we have much to learn from both animalist movements on this and um, well, neurodiversity approaches. But I'm curious what you think because probably you know the topic more than I do. If you want to share your perspective, but you don't have to. You can also type and you can speak or not.
I just wanted to say that I'm not an expert on this either. I just have some interest in more specifically versus companion animals, more specifically animals who are helping animals. I've been to just a few, I guess, workshops for people who train animals for the blind or animals for, I mean, dogs specifically, generally, for people who are say in a wheelchair, I mean, various disabilities. And I found it really interesting seeing the way that the trainers interact with the dogs and how they sort of socialize the puppies from very early on to, it seems like a loving and supportive environment and something that really cares about the dogs and even the dogs that for whatever reason, I don't know that they would use the word choose to become support animals, but the ones that they feel don't, at least the groups that I have seen, the ones that they don't feel are enjoying the work or enjoying learning sort of the rules and roles that they would have as a support animal, they tend to have a very good way of, making sure these animals are still adopted into loving homes. I feel like there is a desire with many of these groups to be very ethical and find animals who it is their choice and their joy to be and help others. But I do wonder about the ethics, and I just find the subject very interesting.
Definitely. Thank you so much for all the examples. I agree with you, and I think maybe sometimes there's a tendency to be like all forms of domestication have to be abolished and all forms of relationships with domesticated animals are ethically problematic. And I get that to some extent. I feel like at the same time, I'm not fully convinced. And so, but that's a personal view. I think if we're going to have like animal companions like dogs and cats, then why not also try and find ways to have supports that is mutually beneficial. So yeah, I thank you for bringing these examples. It's good to hear that people are trying to do the work of doing it properly and ethically. Someone has asked for me to share the slide again, so maybe I can try and do this quickly.
If I may, while you do that, I think
Yeah,
as so often, the problem emerges in the language trainer. It's clearly not an equal relationship. I'm not saying it can't be done ethically. I agree with Ombre. However, when you are conceptualizing it as a human being has a task that an animal must do, rather than forming a true companionship, uh, then we start to see how those power dynamics emerge. And that's so important to think about because it happens to us as autistic people all the time, how that language just is so easily used without examination. So thank you for bringing that up.
yeah, I agree. I think I'm gonna stop sharing, but tell me if that was too short, so I can also see everyone. Someone asked if I think that people who treat autistic adults as children are just being dismissive or not recognizing our humanity. I mean, I feel like it's both, or maybe I'm missing a nuance of what dismissive means. But I would say it's very problematic because it relies on sort of adultist. That's how you would say in French, like adult domination, So it's ableist, but it also assumes that being a child is wrong or um, morally inferior to being an adult, which I think is very problematic. And I feel like that also is very entangled with how we relate to animals in our societies because we tend to treat especially domesticated animals as our children. So I feel like all of this is a set of implicated representations. And in a sense, it is important to recognize the humanity of autistic people in general, which, like, I know I've said critical things about it. We are humans, and it has to be recognized. And I think it's sort of a question of how to balance this recognition and to do it in a way that is not harmful of others, uh, namely animals. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I have autism and I have a teenage son with autism, and I have family members who are incredibly ableist and dismissive, and they treat my 19-year-old like he's five, and it really frustrates me. And I just don't know how to. I have a sibling who's actually a vegetarian who's the most ableist of my siblings, which is ironic. But I just don't know how to get people to not be a-holes. Yeah.
Sorry to hear that, but I know it's so hard and if like there is so much work to be done and if I had solutions I would share, but sadly changing people's representations is such a long job and a long work. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in because the chat has sort of taken off, which is great. But
Yeah.
way back there was a great question. What are the takeaways you'd want everyday people to know in simple terms?
Yeah.
If you would explain it to my parent, like if you were to explain it to my parents, etc.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I would say to embrace the fact that humans are animals and that so maybe that would be one to like not pretend that being a human means not being an animal. We are animals, and that means we have to be responsible to other animals. Another thing is not to think that being autistic makes you necessarily morally better than others. You're not, or worse. Like you're not worse, but you're not better ethically. Being autistic doesn't make us necessarily good to animals. We may like them, but love is not always doing good. So maybe that would be another thing to like be collectively responsible to not representing ourselves in our communities are as necessarily better or purer. That would probably be it. And also to include animals in your diversity because they're part of the movement and they should be in. And we are animals, so I hope that answers. I'm so bad with being synthetic, but I'm trying. I feel like there's so many more things, but I have to find them in the chat. So many cool topics. The last slide.
I can read the question.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
Said, would you be able to speak towards the connection you made in relation to eye contact related to animality versus established for human and social cues?
Yeah, I think I can try and answer this. Um, I get a sense that like relations or sociality between humans relies on a set of norms about visuality a lot sometimes. So it is a lot about eye contact and seeing, but a lot of philosophers and thinkers or just people who know animals and love animals and like live with them have noticed that animals are much more into touch. Um, and you'll see many animals not really looking you in the eyes or like I don't know, eye contact can mean different things in different species, so I'm not going to try and overgeneralize this. I think for dogs, but I'm not sure. I think like they or maybe that's cats. Or I don't know. But I know that some species are more offended, or they may think you're trying to attack them if you look them in the eyes. Someone can correct me afterwards. And for others like cats, if you blink like slowly, that means you feel safe with each other. So eye contact means different things, and I think it's important to see that our human expectations are not the same with other animals, and we should not expect each other to perform specific in specific like species related ways sometimes. Um, and I think that's also why a lot of autistic people feel like a sort of affinity with other animals because their relationship with gaze and eye contact is not the same as the typical human one. So sometimes animal forms of sociality can be an inspiration for rethinking sociality beyond the neurotypical. Uh, yeah. But Don said to ask at the end, so you probably have things you want to share as well.
Can I right now?
Yeah.
So there is the well-known chestnut that you don't look apes in the eye, for example. And I do it all the time. And the thing is, they see you. Like you cannot hide anything from most animals. And because we are so similar to apes, they really get us. And so if there is anything you don't want seen, if there's any secret in your soul, if I might say that, they're going to see it. So it's an amazing experience though, because to actually be seen on a soul level is what we all really want. So I recommend polishing up your soul and going to glance at a gorilla.
I love this. Thank you. Seeing a question. Yeah, do you want to read,
Yes, there's a
Roger?
question about when your work is going to be published.
Yes.
Supposed to be one,
Thank you. So this is a creative, a literary book, an anthology. The name, that's not the final name. We're calling it Divergences, an anthology of neurodissident worlds. I think it's going to be out at the end of this year or the beginning of 2026. We have selected, I think we've finished the selection and people should receive their letters of acceptance or rejection soon. And we're in the process of uh, finalizing the book, so that will be something to look out for. So it's not academic, it's not philosophy, it's mostly literary and artistic. Then I think we have a question by or a comment, which seems interesting. So they're a PhD student working in the realm of conservation genomics, and they love to focus on the ideas of animal-centered conservation. Much of conservation is from the human perspective, which doesn't work as well. Animal-forward climate solutions and behavioral genetics, and how understanding of it is important for conservation in the Anthropocene. They don't have any specific ideas at this moment, but they'd love to have some open-ended conversations with us, I guess, or me, or together, and potentially collaborate professionally. So I guess that's for me. Yeah, I would be very happy to, and because also I'm not a scientist and I don't have the info about the conservation aspect, so I'd be really curious to hear more. And they may have to be down the road because they're dealing with a CSF leak, which I have no idea what that is. But cognition is difficult right now. Yeah, I would love to have a talk. Thank you.
I should add that a few people have mentioned that they're processing the information, and
Yeah.
some time to think about it, and perhaps share the ideas later. I just dropped the link to Discord and Facebook group for these some shared
Yeah.
information.
I think we have a question by who asks if I would say that it can be helpful in these contexts to embrace and point to select norm culture literature in which an outsider human narrator narrates their own human experience as animal, or does this come with its own pitfalls? Thinking of Hesse's Steppenwolf. I don't know that person, so I can't be very specific. Um, I think this is it can be useful. I feel like it can go both ways. Sometimes describing oneself as an animal can be a good way of reclaiming animality and reclaiming not being a typical human. It can also produce harmful effects. And I feel like with all art or literature or like performance, you never really know what the effects are going to be beforehand or once you do it, because it also depends on the readership and how people receive it, the context politically, especially now with like fascism on the rise in the US and Europe and so many different countries. Claiming your animality can be a bit more tricky, and sometimes we need to also insist that we are human because of human rights being stripped away from us. There is this concept, and I'm not going to try and bother you again with concepts, but there is this thinker called Mike Lundblad, who at University of Oslo, who speaks of disanimality, and that's a word that he uses to describe situations where comparisons of disabled people with animals produce sort of uncomfortable affects and reactions in others and in oneself, because it is uncomfortable to think, well, yes, I am an animal, and when sometimes as an animal activist, you may say to another person who is disabled, well, you are an animal. They may not take it very well. And I mean, that's understandable. And I feel like even if it's literary and you're trying to like explain your perspective from an animal position or comparison, it can go both ways. And I mean, I think it's worth doing and it's really interesting and important, but you never know how it's going to go. And that would be my answer to not think that it's an either or kind of question.
The comment from an animal communicator. We work with animals as an animal communicator. Most of my job involves teaching people how to live their animals' lives. I also work with a lot of issues, trauma, animals, and trauma.
I love that. That is so important. And I love seeing more and more people involved in neurodivergence or like the well-being of animals, also from a psychological perspective, because they also have a psychology. They're also persons, as Don said, and it's really cool to see that their needs are also met. And to me, because I haven't really mentioned that in the talk, and maybe that's because I love, grappling with ideas and being very abstract, and that's also my problem. But it's very concrete. If neurodiversity is a movement for well-being, liberation, somatic, like liberty, autonomy, well, it also applies to animals, and they also have to get a chance to live well and not be like harmed by ableist and neuronormative expectations that we have for them. I don't know that book, Becoming Animal by David Abraham, so thank you for the recommendation. I'm going to note that down as well.
There is lots of praise here in the comments for your talk.
That is super kind.
This
Thank
was
you,
a
everyone.
beautiful presentation, gently given. Very much appreciated. It's an interesting comment. Not only does every species have their standard rules and for socialization, but individuals will also have their own rules.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like maybe I should have said this, but in my understanding, what I call ethodiversity, which is just like the diversity of ways of being and behaving in animals, it's not only species at the species level, uh, because as we know, within humans, neurodiversity shows that we're very diverse. So I think it's also the same for other animal species, and that's what I was trying to say with the cats are autistic and dogs are ADHD or have ADHD. It's that even within species, there's individuals who have their own personhoods and their own preferences and their own ways of being in their own rules, as you say. So I think that's really important to acknowledge.
Some people are seeming to think that we have a hard stop at the hour, but we always go over. Usually we say an extra half an hour for a discussion. So I just don't want people to jump off thinking that they have to go if they're interested in staying.
Thank you. And thank you to for bringing the telling us about the dogs and cats and the blinks and the eye contact, because I mix them up. But yes. There's a question from that combines the concepts of human animality and queer identity? Do you think that Therian's identity, therianthropy, which refers to identifying as non-human or not entirely human, and which is a subcategory of alter humanity, can be understood as a way of embracing one's humanity? And they add that Therians are aware that they have a human body, but they identify with another being, most often another animal. They often choose a symbolic animal and adopt, more liberated behaviors. They feel that this is a way of expressing one's humanity. Well, yes, and it's funny you should mention that because I have a paper that is hopefully going to be out in a few months about stereanthropy. I definitely do think that identifying as a Therian is a form of humanity, but I would also add that even though we don't really have the sociological, like the data to back it up, I think from what I've seen, Therian communities are full of autistics. I think that's for a reason because we don't identify as typical humans. I know for a long part of my life, when I was young, I didn't really feel human. I felt like a creature. And I have friends who identified with different species or as like angels or whatever. I think that's part of identity for a lot of us, and which also speaks to how gender for many autistic people is not such, I mean, it can be very important, but sometimes concepts of self are like way beyond gender for us. And I really do regret that in queer communities, these animal or more than human identifications are looked down upon. They're looked as if they invalidate the movement, as if it's like too extreme, as if it's too weird or quirky. I feel like for me, these forms of these movements at least when they're really like conceptualized politically and critically, they are sort of the avant-garde of queerness. Like they're showing us like as you know, like it's I mean I hate that it's linear, but it's often linear. Like they first hated gay people and now or then they accepted them and then it was trans people and now we're kind of in the wave of transness being the main target when it comes to gender. And in a sense, even in trans communities, well, parents are attacked or excluded because like they're not palatable enough for the movement or for the general public. So yes, for me, therianthropy, Therian identities are definitely like part of diversity, eco-divergence, and yes, it's about embracing humanity, and I think it's really cool. I really love that movement.
And as an anthropologist, I reflect that the embodiment of other animals is as old as human culture, as a means of self-expression, as a means of connecting with the natural world, uh, as a means of transcending boundaries. It's a very deep tradition.
Thank you. And to complete that, if I may, in that paper that is hopefully going to be out at some point, I'm using this concept of therianthropy from a philosopher called Roberto Marquezini, who argues that a lot of human culture is actually inspired or drawn from animals. So not only we imitate them, but also these imitations made us human. So when we say animals make us human, that's really true, I think, historically and like from an evolutionary standpoint. He believes that, for instance, we have planes because we saw birds fly and we're like, oh, well, I could live like that. And so we wanted to live like that. And so we did. And so a lot of human culture is drawn from animal cultures. And in a way, Therian identities are just another proof of that in our modern like Western worlds, and that's why they don't really like it when like I mean like people who want to be typical humans because they want to have a divide, but actually it's just about going back to what Don said and how well we have imitated and we have like had these practices before.
And people do it unself-consciously in martial arts. I'm a lifelong martial artist. Be the crane, be the
Mm,
whatever animal form you're doing, you must embody that. And perhaps it's not as frowned upon because it's contextualized, sadly, in violence. Like if you're learning to hurt someone, it's okay. Yeah.
yeah, that makes so much sense, and it is sad.
I'd really like to tell a short story. Is that okay? I feel like I don't want to
Yeah.
run over your jam there.
No, of course, go.
When I was working in ape language studies, I was at a facility that had 67 wild acres, and the bonobos could just essentially run around and be themselves, and the researchers followed them and watched what they were doing, which was brilliant. The first time I met Kanzi, who became a good friend, he was one of the bonobos. He and I were playing chase up and down the fence that was dividing us, and he suddenly stopped and he grabbed his lexigram board and was pointing to words, abstract words, and then he was making some motions with his hands and also speaking. And I couldn't figure out what he was trying to ask me. And so the head researcher came over and we figured out that he was asking me if I was a gorilla. Number one, he saw my essence. Number two, he had seen videos of Coco, the gorilla that used sign language, and thought that all gorillas could use sign language and was asking me in sign language, which no one even knew that he could do, as well as pointing to his regular lexigram board. So like several languages and the abstract thought that went into that was just mind blowing. And people will often say, "Oh, this animal or that has the equivalent intelligence of a 4-year-old child." And I have to say, no, they're brilliant at being who they are in their cultural context. And unlike you, they have gone the whole distance to meet you where you are to communicate with you. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's such a great story. We also have stories that are shared by someone called iPad, so I know it's not their name, but anyways, who shares that they have clairvoyance and they've absolutely been spoken to and been seen by their pets over the years. And adds that they would submit that a lot of what neurotypicals perceive as ESP. Uh, can someone, maybe I missed what ESP is?
Extrasensory perception or psychic phenomena.
Thank you. So that is just autistics being more perceptive or sensitive, particularly to patterns that are closer to their native or to our native way of communicating. And they say this as someone who has moments of telepathy as a neurotypical would perceive it with animals that they're close with. Once their partner's dog told them while we were upstairs that her sister, who was outside, wanted to come in and was waiting at the door, and it was true. And the way she did it was mostly with eye movement, gestures, and body language. Thank you. That is super interesting, and I'm learning a lot because these are not topics I had really considered well enough. And it's nice to see that it speaks to a lot of people to have these kinds of experiences, I feel.
Read a couple more
I
comments.
want, sorry, go ahead, Roger.
No, sure. I'm thinking of this in terms of Western medicine. Physicians often treat humans as aliens, not looking at us as full beings. I'm not sure that they understand that as autistics, we work for a different kind of human.
Right, definitely. And I mean, even as humans, we're also a different kind of animal. So yeah, they don't get that. And I mean, also Western medicine and Western thought is just so full of like mechanistic and like really dehumanizing methods and ideas and concepts. So I'm not surprised, and I get that. I mean, I feel the same way.
Another comment. Let's see. Comment on this is so cool, but they love it. Why do people has so much doubt on your own intelligence and capacity for communication. This is such a concept of evolutionary ability. Of course,
Yeah,
talk to us.
definitely. Maybe someone who knows more than me wants to answer that question of why they do that. Except, I mean, speciesism, they just really do believe that we're different. Maybe that's the core issue, which is, I'm not stupid, that's not the word, but it's really problematic.
For all the people that were asking for additional resources, I wanted to put in a plug for, there are several great movies like Forks Over Knives, for example. And if you really want to understand the industry, the documentary Dominion is the best thing out there. I'll just say, if they can do it to them, they can do it to us. And that's what I started with, was that idea that as long as there is a category of thinking, feeling beings that can be harmed, it leaves that category open for whatever people get into, human people get in the
Yeah.
way of the powerful people who define who a person is in the first place. So it's a very dangerous recipe.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I would add that historically they have done it to humans. I think historically the slaughterhouses have inspired Fordism, so capitalist exploitation of workers. They've inspired Nazi practices. So they would and they will do it again if they must, and or I mean they never have to, they never must, but they will do it again, and maybe they are already. And I agree about the Descartes thing, because yes, I also hate Descartes. As I think most animal people or people who are into animal stuff do. It's done a lot of harm.
An interesting comment. Yes, many of us have also had relationships with animals with senses of humor, which some consider human.
You maybe want to share more? I mean that sounds super interesting, and yes, 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 yes. But if you want to share more of the story, I would love to hear. If you have examples.
That was me again. I just remember just some animals I've known who basically had jokes, things that and I think most of us have experienced this with companion animals, things they know will make us laugh, and so they do those things. And I had I had a dog who her her favorite thing to do was to wait until you were sitting in the kitchen, and then she would want to walk by the doorway and make sure you were watching her, and she would pretend to sneak by the door, and then she would always go and grab something out of the dirty clothes, and like it was a game, but it was funny. You could tell she thought it was funny, and she would run, with the thing that she knew she wasn't supposed to have, and it was a joke. She thought it was a joke. And I had a cat once who he always would wait, make a certain noise, make sure you were looking at him, and then he would do a very particular, very silly flip in the air. And it's so much like human humor, like very much something that they know we think is funny. And how would they know that unless they understand humor? And, I've seen so many animals do that over the years, and I don't know if it's ever been studied.
I've seen gorillas do it. Two young gorilla children were playing hide and seek, and one of them was trying to hide. He was almost a teenager, like had silver hair on his back. He's trying to hide behind this scrawny little bush. And his sister walked by and like pretended that she didn't see him and then attacked him. And they were both, they do, gorillas laugh like that. And they were both just laughing hysterically. And I also had a pig who held a grudge. She was unfairly accused of something. And I mean, she started tearing up the house and doing all these things she never did before. You know, she wouldn't speak to us, she wouldn't look at us. And I finally told the person who had, you know, done her this egregious harm, you've got to apologize in English or this is going to be an untenable situation. And the person did finally apologize, and the pig kind of snorted, and everything went back to the way it was before.
Yes, I think like trying to understand how much, someone else was talking about perhaps this idea that those of us who are autistic often feel like our senses are more attuned and we can pick up on things maybe in a similar way to animals, because who knows how much of the words were understood versus the intent that the animal understood the intent. And I remember after I adopted an ex-racing greyhound, and she had had some difficult times, as you can imagine. And I remember she was so just vibrating with anxiety and nerves, and she was so hungry all the time, and she was so just upset after days. And I remember once finally like getting down, squatting down, and just just very gently telling her that she was safe, she would have plenty of food, she didn't have to do anything, that she was safe. And after that day, she was so much calmer. And I'm not saying she understood my words, but I do believe she understood the intent.
I mean, I think human beings are the only animals that need words, and we usually do that to lie. I hate to say it, but doing talks around the world, people would often ask me, you know, where's the line? Like there has to be a line. Where's the line between humans and animals? And I'd say the degree to which human beings make things up and force other people to believe them.
Speaking of greyhounds, that reminds me of Don Joy Bell's talk. I just dropped the link to the video in case of
I just want to jump in and say, I work with animals as an animal communicator, specifically with rescues and with trauma animals or animals that have things like dementia. I actually have a dog with Down syndrome that I take care of, but the scale of neurodivergence definitely exists in my client list, so I can definitely say that. But also, in my experience doing this work, animals communicate energetically, and it's to me, in my experience or in my personal, working with animals day to day, it's a language. Full stop. Animals communicate energetically, and for me, it's easy. As an autistic person, I struggled with language or talking. I still do, and energetic language is my first language. And so that's the connection. So I just wanted to add that as my experience to the topic.
Thank you so much. This makes me think of Mel bags and they're in my language and how like the expectations of what language should be for humans are so limited. And I feel like what you're saying speaks to this a lot. And it also does really show connections between like autism and animality in that regard, that we may have similar languages. So thank you for sharing.
interesting comment. I often have to discuss with my own child. They're picking up on micro cues that others do not observe. They're broadcasting. True extra sensory is hypersensitivity in the world that often perform minimal perceptions.
I wanted to underscore, Roger brought up Dawn Joy Leong's talk on her companion animal who was a greyhound, rescue greyhound, and their phenomenal connection. We have that on video on the YouTube channel.
Thank you for sharing. I did not know that one. I'm super excited. I just opened the link.
So I can also, under the, we often will take the discussion to our social media platforms, underneath the banner that advertises whatever session we're doing. So I hope people that are interested go there to continue to talk. And I'll also put some links to the movies I mentioned in that discussion.
That is so nice. Thank you. And also, if anyone wants to talk more, you can email me. I can put my email there if you want. I forgot to put it in the slides. Uh, Also, if anyone has more stories to share, I'm super curious. It's so fun to hear more. Whether personal or things you've heard or read or whatever.
Jane Goodall actually recorded an autistic chimpanzee, Flint, who was one of her first close chimps, had, what we would consider classic signs of autism. And in fact, she was such a translator of the world for him to keep him safe from other chimpanzees, that when she died, he stayed near her until he passed as well. And I also knew a transgender gorilla, by the way, female-bodied gorilla who had a silverback and actually took on what are considered male responsibilities in the gorilla family, which was very interesting.
I
Suggesting it's a
love
very
that.
old,
Yeah, I love that so much. It's always so nice to hear these stories. I feel like collectively we're starting to pay more attention to the queerness and transness of nature. But I haven't seen that discussion so much with regards to neurodivergence, or I have, but it's more these comparisons, these metaphors, cats are artistic, which sure it's really fun, and I mean in a sense I do agree, but I think it's more interesting to see also to see which cats, because maybe some cats are actually autistic or ADHD and some others aren't. So I feel like it's interesting to pay attention to this as well. And also, I would also be super curious because to hear about whether neurodivergence and queerness or transness is as entangled in other species as they are in ours, because we know that a lot of autistic people are queer or trans, and maybe more so than allistics. And well, would that chimpanzee be, or that these animals would also be autistic, or yeah, something to maybe explore.
And I concur with Ombre. In anything you want to email me about, I'm always here for everyone. If you'd like to know simple ways to ensure more animal well-being in the world, I would love to help with that. I've mentored many people in a non-judgmental way, and we have fun on the journey. People learn a lot, I learn a lot, so don't hesitate to reach out for that. And I'll ask if anyone has any last questions. Okay, well, again, more This has been wonderful, beautiful presentation. Thank you. Just every positivity you can imagine showed up in the chats today. So that's really wonderful. That makes me very happy. I can't thank you enough for being here. What a great discussion. I love the clarity of your presentation and that you thought to clarify things for people that aren't academics, because this is a cultural group, not an academic group. And people sometimes feel intimidated, and we should always be sharing information on many levels because it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with exposure, whether you understand these terms and ideas. So always happy for us to lift each other up. And also check out our social media for the new and upcoming events. We have so many good ones this year, many more international ones, which I'm really excited about. And yeah, so glad you were all here today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. That has been such a pleasure.